Hey y'all, it's me, Dri. So, for my Dear Dri episode today, I've been thinking about something a lot lately. I think one of the biggest misconceptions people have about healing is that they think clarity is the reward. They think that if they do just enough work, if they learn enough of the lessons, and if they become self-aware enough, that eventually they'll arrive at a place where everything just makes sense. A place where everything becomes obvious, where everything becomes easy to identify. And because it's easy to identify, well, it becomes easy to navigate. And I guess at one time I used to think those things also. I used to think that one day I would become so familiar with distortion that it would stop showing up in my reality. I thought that once I learned enough lessons, that the lessons, they would have to just, well, they'd stop. Or at the very least, I thought the lessons would become easier. And now, I don't know, after the last few weeks, I don't think that's true at all anymore, because lately I've been realizing that clarity isn't always the reward. Sometimes I'm realizing that clarity is the cost. Because once you truly see something, you can't go back. You can't unknow it. You definitely can't unsee it. And that's where I've found myself lately, is in that very space. I haven't been struggling to understand what it is that I'm looking at. And I'm not struggling to figure out what something means. No. I'm not struggling to determine whether a situation is aligned either. The struggle has been something totally different. The struggle for me has been accepting what I already see. And really, that's a completely different lesson. Because when I first started healing, discernment, it looked one way. Back then, at that time, everything was loud. The lessons were loud. The red flags were loud. The emotional imbalance I felt was loud. And the manipulation, that was loud. When I first started healing, my nervous system was constantly activated. My body was constantly trying to get my attention, and something always felt off. And because something felt off, I ended up spending years learning how to trust myself. I spent years learning how to listen, years learning how to identify patterns. I spent years learning the difference between intuition and fear. I spent years learning the difference between discernment and hypervigilance, and years learning the difference between what was happening and what I was afraid might happen. And eventually, after all those years and after working on all of those things, the work I was doing started paying off, because I became more grounded, then I became more regulated, then I became more self-aware and more connected to myself. And if you would have asked me years ago what I thought would happen next, I probably would have told you that life would become easier to read. But that is not exactly what has happened. What happened was something far more interesting than that, because the lessons now, they've gotten smarter, not more difficult, just smarter, because distortion doesn't always show up looking distorted. Sometimes it shows up looking aligned. Sometimes it shows up looking exciting. Sometimes it looks promising. And sometimes it shows up and it looks exactly like something you've been asking for. And that is where the lesson becomes complicated. Because when something is obviously unhealthy, the decision, that is usually pretty clear. Maybe not easy, but it's clear. Because then the challenge is letting go. The challenge is walking away. The challenge is honoring yourself enough to choose differently. But when something appears healthy, when something appears aligned, or when something appears promising, the challenge, it changes. Because now you're no longer evaluating whether you want it. Now you're evaluating whether it's actually what it appears to be. And that is where I think healing becomes incredibly nuanced. Because I'm realizing that the healthier I become, the less confusion I experience when a pattern reveals itself. That part of it has gotten easier for me. I don't spend weeks convincing myself I'm imagining things anymore like I used to. I don't spend months explaining away what exactly it is that I'm seeing. And I don't sit around trying to force puzzle pieces together that clearly aren't fitting. Now I just see the inconsistency. I see the pattern. And I see the disconnect. And once I see it, I see it. And that's it. So the difficult part isn't identifying it. I guess the difficult part for me is accepting it, because sometimes there's something you wanted on the other side of that possibility, right? Maybe it's a connection or an opportunity. Maybe it's an experience. Maybe it's a future you briefly imagined, or maybe it's a version of a person you hoped was real. And then when clarity arrives, you don't just lose the distortion. You lose the possibility that was attached to it. And I think that's why so many people struggle with discernment to begin with. Not because they don't see, because they do. I think most people see far more than they give themselves credit for, actually. The problem is that seeing something and accepting something, those are not the same thing. Because accepting it, that often requires grief. Accepting it often requires letting go. And accepting it often requires releasing the version of the story that you hoped was true. And all of that can be painful, especially when the situation looked promising, especially when the opportunity looked aligned, and especially when the person reflected parts of you that felt familiar. Because then really you're not just letting go of what is, you're letting go of what could have been. And lately I've realized that this might actually be one of the final stages of discernment. Not learning how to see, but learning how to honor what you've already seen. Because there was a time in my life when I couldn't see the pattern. That caused me a lot of grief and heartache. Then there was a time in my life when I could see the pattern, but I didn't trust myself. That caused me a lot of grief too. Then there was a time in my life when I trusted myself, but I was still negotiating with exactly what it is that I knew. And now I'm finding myself in a different place than all of those, because now I see it. Now I trust myself. And the lesson becomes whether I am willing to respond accordingly. The lesson becomes whether I am willing to release something after the pattern becomes clear, or whether I am willing to choose myself over the possibility. Whether I'm willing to honor reality instead of potential. And I think that's what integrating the new version of ourselves back into the world actually looks like now. Because healing isn't about hiding from life. And healing, that's not about avoiding experiences. Healing also isn't about building walls around ourselves. Healing is about participating fully in life while remaining connected to yourself. It's about staying open, staying curious, staying hopeful, and staying engaged, and still being willing to acknowledge what we see when it reveals itself, even when we don't like it, and even when seeing it disappoints us, and even when we wish the answer were different. Because clarity, that definitely does not always feel good. Sometimes clarity will break your heart, because sometimes clarity ends a fantasy. Sometimes clarity closes a door, and sometimes it removes an option. And sometimes clarity asks you to walk away from something you genuinely wanted to explore. And that's why I think clarity is so often misunderstood, because people talk about clarity like it's this magical destination. Like, once you arrive there, everything feels peaceful. Everything feels certain, and everything feels easy. But I'm here to say that that has not been my experience. My experience is that clarity often arrives carrying a big responsibility. Because once you know, you know. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And then the question has to become, what are you going to do with what you've seen? And I think that's the lesson I've been sitting with lately. The lesson isn't learning how to see, because I already see. The lesson has to be learning how to honor what I've seen. And the lesson has to be trusting myself enough to release the things that aren't aligned. The lesson is trusting myself enough to stop negotiating with the reality. And the lesson is understanding that discernment doesn't exist to make my life smaller. No. Discernment exists to keep me connected to myself while my life gets bigger. Because the more visible you become, the more opportunities life will place in front of you. The more people you'll meet, the more experiences you'll encounter, the more possibilities will appear. And that is exactly why discernment matters the most. Not less, more. Because healing didn't remove the lessons. It simply changed their shape. And what I've discovered is that the lessons, they never stopped. They've gotten better disguised. They've gotten more sophisticated. They come in and they look right. And it takes observing It takes observing and being self-aware of everything. And when you get calm like that, the contrast, it just naturally shows. And then that's where the real work starts. Or at least that's where it's starting for me at this time. So that's what I got for y'all today. If you made it to the end, please do leave me a comment and let me know. And as always, remember, where there is love, there is light. I'll see y'all again real soon.